lecture in the Nationalism and Sectionalism unit is focusing on the growing power of the federal government, right? And as the power of the federal government grows, there's a sense of nationalism or pride in one's own country, which is kind of fueling that rise in nationalism, especially in regards to kind of foreign policy. But there's also that tension there of people being more proud to be Southern or Virginian, whatever it may be, and so that's a tension that we see throughout the American history. And in this lecture in particular, we're going to look at how this sense of nationalism then leads to the national government, the federal government, getting more powerful. And really, an important way that the federal government grows its power is actually through the Supreme Court, through that judicial branch of the government. And there's a couple of important court cases that we should know about in order to better understand how federal power can increase during this time. One of them is the court case Gibbons v. Ogden, and this is in the year 1824. And essentially what happened was in New York State, the New York State Assembly, the New York State Legislature, gave Fulton, the inventor of the steamship, a monopoly over steam shipping in the state, right? So he was the only one that could own companies that use steamships. He then, in return, hired subcontractors to drive ferry lines between New York and New Jersey. Right, so he paid someone then to run a line between New York and New Jersey on the Hudson River. This was where the man Ogden comes into play. Right? When he does this, though, steam shipping is a very lucrative business, and other people want to get in on it. And so a man last name Gibbons believes that New York State really had no right to kind of do this, right? New York State had no right to tell him he could not use a shipping company in New Jersey, right? Because they had no authority over that. And so he begins running his own company, fully anticipating that this would go to go to the courts and be figured out there. And so in this court case in 1824, the Supreme Court of the United States, nicknamed SCOTUS, rules that individual states, like New York, cannot regulate interstate commerce. Only the federal government can, right? So New York State had no right to regulate New Jersey companies using the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. They only have right over what's going on within New York State only. So the person that could regulate that, though, is the federal government. And that authority of interstate commerce, or the authority over interstate commerce, is established here in Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. So that's one step here promoting the increase in power of the federal government. Another case that actually happens earlier, but dealing with something different here, is McCulloch v. Maryland. And at this time, Maryland, the state of Maryland, did not approve of or support the Bank of the United States. And so the Second Bank of the United States that we saw was passed as part of the American system. And so Maryland's Assembly passes a tax that they're going to tax the local branch of that bank. So that any branch in Maryland would be taxed in the hopes that it would cause the bank to fail and shut down. The Chief Justice at the time, Chief Justice Marshall, ruled that Maryland could not tax a federal bank because the federal legislation supersedes or is higher than state legislation, right? And this would do the opposite. This would give states the power to overrule federal legislation. This should sound familiar to us, right? This kind of sounds like nullification, right? When in the Sedition Acts, when Kentucky and Virginia voted to nullify that law, right? It was a federal law trying to be nullified by a state. Here we have something similar: a state trying to limit or harm a federal law, and the Supreme Court the Supreme Court's knocking it down. Right? Justice Marshall also rules in other laws that limits the states' rights at the expense of expanding the federal powers. In foreign policy or dealings with foreign nations, there's a real strong sense of nationalism and national unity, which is kind of a good thing. This is kind of one spot. Internally, there's issues, but with foreign affairs, it's kind of a united front. And both sides kind of recognize and prioritize the expansion of the nation. So, for example, in 1817, there was something called the Rush-Bagot Treaty, in which the British and the Americans agreed to demilitarize the Canadian-American border. They established the 49th parallel line, which is a latitudinal line used by maps, as the border between Canada and the United States for the most part. 2 years later, there's the John Adams, and Onease Treaty, John Quincy Adams, and Onease Treaty. and that is when Spain gives Florida to the United States, and also they give up any claims they claim to have had to the Oregon Territory, which would be the modern northwestern part of our country, Washington State, Oregon State. So there's some real advances in helping shore up Americans' boundaries and expanding westward. So this map here kind of shows that to you, right? So in 1803, under President Jefferson, we have the Louisiana Purchase, which is that purple shaded region there. Massive size, right? It helps double the size of the country. The Convention of 1818 helps kind of settle some disputes with Canada and the British over the border. And the Adams O'Neese Territory gives that land shaded in yellow in Florida and along the Gulf of Mexico. And the Oregon Territory up there in the northwestern part of the country, Spain gives up its claims. Britain still claims part of this territory, but eventually that 49th parallel is going to be the dividing line. So everything south of that 49th parallel line, which you can see up here, is going to be given to America, and everything north will become part of Canada and the English territory. We also see here that Maine becomes a state in 1820, and that's part of something called the Missouri Compromise that we're going to get to. At the same time, so the presidency after Madison is a man named James Monroe. So under Monroe, a foreign policy initiative is started known as the Monroe Doctrine. And essentially what this is that President Monroe comes out and declares to other nations, so the European nations in particular, that the Western Hemisphere was no longer the realm of European politics. Right? So his official statement said that Europeans should not establish new colonies. Europeans should not try to overthrow any newly independent republics. By this point, we have Haiti becomes a new country, and countries like Mexico and Argentina and Bolivia are beginning to become new countries as well. And that if any of these things happen, that would be considered dangerous to American interests, and that the Americans would deal with that accordingly. So that essentially meant, we possibly can go to war with you if it needs to be. We can use other actions to limit, your authority in this region of the world. So it establishes America kind of as the leader of the Western Hemisphere. In return, though, they agree to kind of remain out of European affairs and not get involved in any of the battles and fights happening there. And by and large, this doctrine is pretty much upheld and kind of accepted by most people in Europe at the time. And so it's kind of seen as a key moment of America kind of first stepping out and showing their international power. On top of this, though, we have continued and constant westward migration. Remember, the Louisiana Purchase has been gained by the United States, which gives us lots of new territory. So much so that by 1818, the U.S. goes from 13 to 22 states, which is really, really key, right? And this map here kind of shows us some of those new states: Alabama, Mississippi, Illinois, and then eventually Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. All those states begin entering as well. But at this time, there's a growing sense that slavery, should be abolished and should not be allowed. And this is going to lead to a pretty intense debate and near civil war in 1820. The state of Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slaveholding state, but the Northerners feared that this would then create an imbalance between the slave and free states, which essentially there had been almost equal between free and slave states represented in the Senate. And the fear was that by letting Missouri come in as a slave state, that would be unfair to northern states. In the middle of this debate, though, Alabama is admitted as a slave state. So now that fear of imbalance has occurred. And so there's this real threat, and the northerners are refusing to admit Missouri. But then that man, Henry Clay, we talked about, the Great Compromise we mentioned in a previous lecture, works out a compromise with the people in Congress, with the representatives in the North and the South. And so what it does is it allows Missouri to enter as a slave state, but also admits Maine as a free state, so that balances out. And from then on, it's established at the 36-degree latitude line as the future dividing line between slave and free states. So what that means is anything below this line here, anything south of this red line on the map, would be eligible to enter the Union as a slave-holding state, and anything north of that line would be allowed to enter as would be entered only as a free-holding state. So essentially, Missouri is the sole exception here of a state that could be north of this line that would be not free. All right, and so this map kind of shows us the free states at the time, are these yellow ones, all in the North and Midwest. Slave-holding states are in the South, but also as far north as Maryland and Delaware. territory that at the time could be open to slavery, and the purple is territory that could be open to, would be close to slavery, would be open to free states. So how the map looks at this point, right? Because all this land here, California and the New Mexican territories, is not yet part of America. So really what this compromise does is it really, seemingly at the time, limits dramatically the expansion of slavery, right? It looks like only one or two more states could enter in as slaveholding states, and the rest would be entered in as free states. We'll talk about this in the next unit, but that will change dramatically. This compromise, the effect of this compromise will weaken dramatically once we have all the southwestern territory gained as a result of a war. And so we'll get to that in the next unit. So we're going to end here now with the Missouri Compromise, and really, I can't emphasize enough how important this compromise is. It holds the country together for another 40 years, and it really kind of keeps the peace between the North and the South for a long time, at least to the 1840s, 1850s. So it's a really important thing that we should know and be able to recognize on quizzes, tests, midterms, and regents.